Hello everyone, hello friends from everywhere around the world. Thank you very much for joining this second episode, which discusses my spring start here. As I was saying last time, probably the most appreciated of my books, and going through it, we'll probably we'll probably manage to go deeper through everything that represents spring basics. So for you here who want to learn more and get deeper, and especially if you are beginners starting with the spring ecosystem, that this playlist might help you a lot, or at least I hope that it will help you a lot. Actually, I'm going to share my screen because we said we are just going to continue today. I'm not going to marketize too much. It's already the book, so I don't have to show it to you. It's already published in multiple languages. Sorry, Spanish is not yet one of them. I saw your comments. I hope that maybe you will get a translation in Spanish at some point as well. So thank you very much for all your messages and everything that I have received in the past, all the reactions that I have received in the past week. I was very happy to see all of them. And of course, if you are here with me live today, remember you have a live chat there. I always keep an eye on the live chat so you can start your discussions, ask questions, and make these more interactive. And of course, if you didn't join us live, you can still ask your questions in the comments section. Or you can simply, and I would advise you follow me also on Twitter and LinkedIn, and we can discuss there as well. So what's chapter 2 about? Is the spring. It's basically we start discussing the spring context, because if you take a look on the table of contents, which is here on the left side of the screen, you see that it's chapter 2, 3, 4 and 5. All 4 of them are about the spring context. So as you can see, the spring context is not, first of all, an easy subject. I mean, there are a lot of things to discuss. I don't want to imply it's difficult, because I don't want to you understand this is complex, and I don't want to scare you. It's something that you will understand going through these 4 chapters. But it's something so important. You can imagine I wouldn't have spent so many pages and so many chapters discussing the spring context if it weren't so important. Actually, and we will discuss this today, is one of the most important things, maybe the most important of the basics of spring. If you don't understand properly the spring context, you don't understand properly anything in spring, because the spring context is the place that drives what spring can and what spring can't manage, can't manipulate. No, I discuss here about the object instances that you create, and you want the framework to be able to control. And that's basically, hopefully you remember our last time's discussion, that inversion of controls thing, where we say that is no longer the application controlling the execution, but it's a framework controlling the execution, and thus controlling also the objects that you define, which may contain business logic, for example, which contain the things that you want to happen. This is inversion of control. You allow the framework control the application, and not the application control its own execution. The control reverses, inverts. That's why it's called inversion of control. And I was saying last time, and that's basically what we discussed throughout these 4 chapters, that dependency injection is one of the ways in which inversion of control is implemented. Dependency injection is a way in which we give the framework control over the instances, and tell the framework how the instances link to one another. The second principle that you will learn, which is something we will discuss here in chapter 6, where we discuss aspects, and AOP, which is aspect-oriented programming, is the control over the methods. So see, there are two things that make inversion of control possible. The control over the instances themselves, meaning control over their attributes, over their characteristics, and the control over their behavior, which are the methods. And you will see that Spring allows you control even that. So it allows you control the characteristics of your objects, as well as the characteristics of as well as the execution of their behavior. And this full part 1 of the book, which is called Fundamentals, is about inversion of control through Spring. If you know this, you have all the needed basics to go further and basically learn whatever project from module or project. Now, we had a discussion last time about that, from the Spring ecosystem that you want. You will find that I'm right once we finish the discussion. And please do ask your questions if you have throughout the lesson. So let's continue with chapter 2. And we said that we are starting discussing Spring context and dependency injection. And there are a few things. See, the roadmap is pretty clear from the table of contents. You first learn how to define beans. A bean is an instance that Spring can control. So a bean is just kind of a more special object, a more special instance actually of an object. It's not only a Java object of its own, it's a Java object that Spring knows about. So it's an instance of an object, but one that Spring can control. In order to allow Spring to control this instance, you have to put it somewhere where Spring can see it. And that somewhere is called the context. And that context is supported by a container, and that's what we start discussing, and that's what we are going through in the next chapters. So you see what you learn. This is the roadmap. You define the beans, you learn how to create beans, you learn how to make a normal instance of an object become a bean. Then you learn how to wire, how to link them. This is actually the dependency injection stuff that we discuss actually. So the dependency injection mainly starts somewhere in chapter 3. You learn how to link one bean to another. And then you learn how to use abstractions. So how to work through types, such in a way in which you make your code more flexible for changes. And then we discuss, of course, we will have to discuss the life cycle. How long does a bean live? How long can a bean be used by the framework? This is essential because when you create an object, you are entitled to use it for as long as you want, and your application controls it. But how do you tell Spring how long can it control a bean? How long can that instance live? There should be a way in which you define that, and there is a way, and we will discuss it in chapter 5. See, this is the roadmap. So we discussed about the importance of frameworks and Spring in the real world, and now we start with how you make Spring, how you configure Spring control your objects, and then in the last chapter of the fundamentals, how you allow Spring control the behavior of your objects. And you've learned the very fundamentals of the language. If you go through this first part, I'm not going to go through part 2 until we reach that point. You will learn at the beginning of the part 2 why I have chosen exactly these chapters. But now hopefully you know at least what comes next for part 1, which is very important. Always as a reader of the book, I find it very importantly to understand the roadmap, to understand not only what I'm learning, but how I'm learning it and why I'm learning it. And that's why I'm telling you all this. Okay, that's why I stress now on this, because I wanted to understand where are we going, what is our journey through learning Spring. So yeah, I'll say by default Spring doesn't know any of the objects you define in the application. So regardless you've added or not your Spring dependencies, any instance that you create as a new Java instance is not known by Spring. What does that mean? It means you created the object, it exists, but Spring will not be able to do anything with it. So unless you make it visible somehow to Spring, you don't use Spring. There is a big definition, and you have to understand the difference between where and what from your application can Spring control and what cannot, what it can't. And remember, this very one single thing that you actually need to remember in this at this point is Spring can only control the object instances that you have explicitly created and added in this context. Anything else can't be controlled. You want any instance to be manipulated by Spring, you need to make it a bean. That is, put it somehow in this bucket, or call it whatever, which is called the context. What is actually the context? The context is the total set of instances that Spring can control. Okay, when you say the context is nothing more than just all the instances from your application that you have given them the importance of Spring being able to control them. That is the context. So when someone says application context or Spring context, in this case being one and the same, when they say application context is just a group of instances that a given framework can control, you will hear the same concept with other frameworks as well. For example, you will hear about context when we discuss about Hibernate or JPA in general. We will not go into this subject, definitely today not. But I just make you aware, when you hear about context, like Hibernate context, Spring context, I don't know, etc. context, framework has a context, it's actually the beans that you, the instances that you allowed that framework to control. And again, same is with all the frameworks when you use this concept. We say that we use a container for that. Spring provides a container. I don't want to overcomplicate things. It doesn't make sense to go too technical. Just think about the following. Just imagine that the container is nothing more than a collection, like an array list, to make it as easy as possible. Of course, I know things are a little bit more complicated than that, but it will not help you anyway if from the beginning you think about all these complications. Just think about the container as being just a collection where if you have added an instance, Spring knows about it and will be able to use it. Just think about that this way. And I see some messages, so let me read a part of them and see if there are questions I can answer. Chapter 4, where I explain bean scope. if it's chapter 4, I will reach at some point chapter 4. Okay, so let's leave it for chapter 4 because now it's chapter 2, so I don't want to mix things up. I promise that I will go chapter by chapter, and this is the entire purpose of this playlist. So at some point I'm gonna discuss about that as well, so let's keep it that way. So okay, I'm not gonna. Okay, there are multiple ways to create a context. Which type of context one should use? I read your book. Okay, we will go through this one definitely. So give me the chance. It's possible to use dependency injection without a context? Yeah, that's a good question. Now, some would argue that dependency injection in general mean just giving the reference to a specific object, to an attribute of another. I don't agree with that. I think when we discuss about dependency injection, we discuss about something more related to IOC, to inversion of control. So having dependency injection without a context, I don't know any other mechanism, usually a framework such as, again, Spring, but also Hibernate and others, they do use contexts. They need to understand, to know the objects before they are able to reference from one to another. So to answer your question, I would say the answer is no. You first need a context, and then once you have the context, which means the total, the amount of beans, the amount of object instances a framework, Spring in this case, can control, it can control anything including the dependency, the behavior execution, which we will discuss in chapter 6, and through this you can augment everything with certain capabilities. Okay, we will discuss about the difference between bean and components, so just stay here, bear with me, we will take them step by step, and if there are still things that are not clear or you think I have skipped them, you can always make me attentive. So let's go further, and I think we have already discussed and you have understood it. All these paragraphs, they tell you exactly what I was telling you now. What is a bean? Can you imagine now? Do you understand what a bean really is? It's very important. So it's not something complex. It's just an instance of an object that Spring is aware of. Once you have added an instance to the context, you have created, you've marked it as a bean. It became a bean. Okay. Once it's a bean, Spring can control it. How does Spring control it? The way you tell Spring to control it. You are still the one configuring Spring in which way that object will be controlled. But very important, you cannot tell Spring to control something that you haven't made Spring aware of upfront, which means you cannot configure something to be controlled by Spring if you haven't made that something a bean, which means if you haven't previously put that instance in the context. Okay, I'm gonna go very fast, very quickly through this chapter 2 on creating a Maven project. I want to make you aware of the fact that this was initially taught by me as an appendix, and I was kind of convinced not to put it forced, to put this as a subchapter, even though I still don't think it really makes sense for it to be here, but it wasn't really only my decision. So the point is, you need to use either Maven or Gradle normally. I know you can do it without them, that's fine if you are a geek, but normally we do need at least to control our dependencies somehow. So in this book I've chosen Maven because it's largely used. If you like Gradle more, you can use Gradle. It doesn't make a lot of a difference anyway, because the code that we discuss, the Spring code, will be the same regardless of what build tool are you using. But I went through this because all my projects in this book will use Maven, so I have added this very short talk about Maven just because I cannot be sure from the very beginning that whoever picked this book has already worked with a build tool, so I wanted to give them the minimum. You will see the minimum throughout us working through it, so you don't necessarily have to discuss all the details. Also, you might see throughout the book, which was released, I don't know, 2020 or 2021, I don't remember exactly. Anyway, it was some time ago, so at that time the latest version was 14, and the latest long-term supported version was Java 11. Today is 21. So you would say, oh, this is so old, no? Should I still read this book? Well, it doesn't make any difference, actually, to be honest with you, if you are using Java 11 or 21 with what I discuss in this book. Even the Spring version that I was using here was 5 point something. Anyway, it's different. It's years ago, no? All the things that are discussed here, they are still same valid, so it's basics. They didn't change, or at least not that much, so don't worry. In our playlist today I will go through using Java 21, the latest long-term supported, but even if you see that the book uses an older Java version, don't be afraid. It's not old information, okay? 2021, yeah, that was, thank you very much. I even forgot what was the year. So because I started it in 2020. No, I was telling you last time that it takes about a full year to write a book. So yeah, it's not easy. Okay, cool. So let me go through that. I don't think you need we need to discuss all this now about Maven, because you will see it in examples. I'm pretty sure you will understand. And I want to go straight to this chapter 2.2. This section 2.2, adding new beans to the Spring context, which is the essential, and that's, I think, this one, which contains 3 sections itself, is the one that also should answer the previous question. Someone asked me, let me find it, what's the difference between bean and component? See, so that's where you will find out what's the difference between a bean and the component. In section 2.2.1 we discuss about using a bean, and then in 2.2.2 we discuss about stereotype annotation. A component, as well as service, repository, controller, they are stereotype annotations, and both of them are used for the same purpose, is creating an instance and putting it in the context, which means creating a bean. Yeah, and of course there is a difference because we do use both of them, so it's not that one is better than the other. They are simply useful and better to use in certain scenarios, and that's what you want to learn now. And then we will end with programmatically adding beans, which means you have to somehow develop some capability, some logic, and throughout this logic's execution you make some of the objects beans in the context, which is not as often encountered as the first two, but in some cases you might find it handful, like to have the flexibility to implement your own logic to put beans in the context. But again, the whole 2.2 section is about how we make an object instance known by Spring, which are the ways, and what can we use and when. So yeah, like, I like pictures, and I think I actually didn't put enough pictures in this book, so there should have been more diagrams than I have created. I think in a second edition I will enhance a bit my diagrams. But the point is, when you create an instance with new, say you have a class parrot, and you say parrot p is new parrot. You create an object instance with Java. But even if that object instance is in a Spring application, that will not be understood by Spring simply because it's not in the context. I represented here the context as this rectangle, meaning the collection, the amount of beans that the amount of instances that Spring see. So it's empty. Empty meaning at the moment, if this is the application and I have created an instance of an object typed parrot, and I haven't created that instance as a bean, then there is an object there and my application can use it, but Spring cannot because the context is empty. So Spring doesn't know that instance, will not be able to control it if it's outside. So this is how the class looks like. Now you have a class parrot. It even has an attribute that I called named, I called name, say the parrot has a name. And it's a simple object. At the moment, that's what we call actually a POJO, no? A plain old Java object. POJO is when you refer to this kind of an object, usually describing something, describing some structure, you know, like in my case, describing a parrot that has a name. And this is a very, very simple starting main. That's the only thing it is doing is creating that parrot. And again, saying even if you have the Spring dependency in your application, that still that parrot here, whose reference has been assigned to this variable for any reason, it's not manageable by Spring because this is not, has not been added anyhow in the Spring context. Okay, some other questions. So what criteria do we use to determine if an object should be a bean or not? Very good question actually. So let's go through that. I have spent like already almost 30 minutes of our today's class to discuss about what a bean is, but it seems that I failed to give you an important information. I'm very happy that you have asked this question. What do we create as a bean and what shouldn't we create as a bean? Should all our objects be beans in the Spring context, in a Spring application? And the answer is no. It doesn't make sense for all the objects to be beans. Actually, it only makes sense to make a bean or those instances that need to be augmented with certain capabilities. And do you remember from last time that we said that the reason of using a framework is to allow us to easily augment our application with certain capabilities, and we enumerated a few of the simplest, which are transactionability, security, logging, and so on. When do we make an object a bean? When do we really make the bean? For example, here you will see that this chapter is a little bit more theoretic because we discuss about creating beans, and we use objects. We use simple objects like parrot just to allow. Why do I use this simplicity? Because I want you to focus on what's important. It's a teaching strategy. You know, I want you to your brain to leave aside to think, aha, parrot. What's it? Something so dumb, so dumb that my brain doesn't need to understand why parrot and what a parrot is. That's very important because this allows you to focus on what we discuss here and what you need to learn in this chapter, which is actually how you add the instance of whatever object to the context. But this way, this approach might also have disadvantages, and one of the disadvantages is that up front you might not see which would be actually the real object that I would really need to add to the context. Would I actually add a parrot to a Spring context? Most or an object similar to parrot, which in the end we will understand it as a DTO, as a data transfer object, or as a record. Why not, depending on what we create? And the answer is actually no. And the reason is because when you add an instance to the Spring context, you add it to a Spring context because later you want to augment that object with a capability through Spring. So unless you need to control that object somehow, for example, you want to add transactions on it, you want to add security on it, you want to add some monitoring and observability capabilities on it, you need to add anything that might be added through Spring. If you need to augment it with anything like this, then you make it as a bean. If you don't need that, then not only that, you don't add it as a bean. It's not even advised to do that. It doesn't make sense to make the context larger with objects that you don't need, because again, Spring would have to manage them. And the larger the context is, the more difficult for the framework would be to manage it. So on the contrary, you prefer to add only those instances that really need to be beans. So you really need to make sure that you add only the needed instances to the context, only those for which you expect you have to augment them with certain capabilities. You have to wrap their behavior in transactions, or you have to apply observability, or you have to apply authorization rules, or whatever case is. If there is a capability Spring needs to apply on that object, then that object needs to be a bean. If there isn't, then you don't make it a bean at all. Okay. I hope that actually answered this, and I know that some of the things you will also understand throughout working and going through the chapter. Does the Pojo have any limitations? Can they extend, inherit? Do they need no art constructor, etc.? Well, they do have certain limitations depending on how you create them. So for example, and that's basically one of the differences that we will even discuss between the bean and the stereotype annotations, because in some cases they do need, for example, to have, or they might need to have, no ars constructor. Okay, and I will discuss them throughout the entire talk on the Spring, because it's easier with an example rather than answering you only with words. Okay. Okay, so let's actually go further. I see this were for the moment the question. So you see, I'm going here, and in listing 2.5, you can see that I have added this dependency, which is called the Spring context. Okay, so I've added this dependency, and this is the only dependency needed if you need the context. Very important to remember that Spring is created to be modular. There is no one Spring dependency to rule them all. There are many dependencies that you might add or not to your project. This is really important because it allows you to minimize the footprint of your application, making it as small as possible, allowing you to only use what is to be used. Imagine what if we only had one dependency for the whole Spring. Then you would have to you would add it to your application and usually use only 0.1% of it, but it would come with all the possible binaries and everything, making your application huge. How would we have microservices if you would add gigabytes of dependencies to it just to use a small part. No, it wouldn't even work. So Spring Context is that small part of Spring that you can add to your application when you want to use context and dependency injection. This is the only thing that gives you, but is basically the most basic of the things, because without it there is nothing. So this is actually also the minimum thing that you would add to a Spring application, because regardless of what you regardless of what you add in the end and which are the capabilities, whether you use transactions, logging, or something more complicated, you need at least to have a context. So this is the minimum thing that you will add. It will always be there somehow, okay? And I'm doing here this as well. I'm adding it to my application. I have a Maven project now, and I have a dependency to the Spring Context, giving me the Spring capability of context and dependency injection. And that will allow me make an instance such as this one a bean, meaning start a context and add instances in certain ways to the context. And that's what we want to discuss. Okay, so now let's see how this actually changes. Instead of having an instance, a plain Pojo instance like this one. Now, first of all, I do create a context instance here. And the context instance that I create is using a class called annotation config application context. Now, I want you actually to understand the following, that there is an interface called application context, and I'm not sure if actually I'm not sure if I do specify this here anywhere. Okay, maybe later or not, but the point is there is an interface called application context, and there are multiple implementations of this application context. So naturally nowadays we use, and that's something that you will learn through the journey, that for configuring, for telling Spring what to do with our beans, we do use annotations. In the past, we were using XML files, for example. So there were implementations of the application contexts. This object basically contains the logic behind the scenes, knowing how to interpret the annotations. But you might have, for example, contexts implementations that know how to interpret XML files. And in very old applications, and that was like the way we used to do that maybe 15-20 years ago, we would have used something like file system XML application context. It's one of the implementations, or class path XML application context. If you search those two classes, for example, they are very similar. They do the same thing. They are an implementation of the application context, the interface defining the context in Spring. But those implementations were used to allow you configure the context not through annotations, which is what I'm teaching you today, because this is how we do it today, and fortunately many years from now on in the future. In the past, you were using large XML, large, heavy, ugly, miserable XML files. And I will not show you how one of those look like, and I promise you, you don't want to know, okay? So if you have never seen that, you don't want to know either, okay? Okay. So that's why I'm using this. And now the purpose, what do I want to do? I want that instance not to be created outside of the context like it was in one of the previous figures, but I want it to be here in the context, such that Spring can understand it. Okay. And this is how we start with the first way in which you can do that, which is the annotation called @bin. So in this section, we discuss about @bin, and then basically we will discuss the stereotype annotations, and then we make the comparison between them. So you still have to be patient to understand that. And this is another very nice diagram that shows you how you create an instance inside the Spring context using @bin. And first things first, I want you to understand, to remember that when you use @bin, should always be in a class that is marked as a configuration class. The configuration classes are particular classes that we use to define configurations. That's why they are called configuration classes. To create a configuration class, use the @configuration annotation over the class. An application might have multiple configuration classes, and that is fine. You can have more than one configuration class, although with our discussion here, we will start with, and usually we will only have one, okay? Then, one of the things you can do within a configuration class is defining instances in the Spring context, aka bins, okay? And that's what we learned here. So I want you to understand this is not the only thing that you can do in a configuration class. There are other things you can do with a configuration class. Sometimes you have to extend other classes, override methods, etc., etc. I don't go now into details. I want you to focus specifically on what we do now. Within the configuration class, here I want to create a parrot, but I don't want to create a parrot that is like any other parrot instance. I want to have a parrot instance that Spring also knows about. So I create a method that returns a parrot instance, and I'm annotating it with @bin. And what happens if I do that is that whatever instance I return here in the method will automatically be placed in that group of instances that Spring knows about and Spring can manipulate. And this is the first way to create an instance in the Spring context and make Spring know about it. Okay. Of course, now you will ask, hey, what about this config class? How does Spring know that the configuration class is a configuration class and to scan it and to execute this method and so on? Well, you do have to specify the configuration class as a parameter of the instance of application context that you create when you use the annotation config application context class, like this one here. This one will get as a parameter, will get as a parameter the configuration class or classes. You might have more than one configuration class. If you have more, there are certain ways, more than one, in which you can have, and the simplest is probably just to enumerate them with a comma here. So, but we only have one, So this whole setup allows us creating a specific kind of object into the Spring context, and from now on this will be known this way. And I want to I still have 15 minutes, and it's clearly I will not have the time to discuss the whole chapter today, but there's not a problem. We will continue it in the next lesson. I will start my IntelliJ now, and I want to also show you, because one of the things I want you to do when you get my books and you read my books is please don't only go through the book like we do here, but also, and that's what I'm gonna do with you, also try to do everything by yourself. And you will see that with each of the books, with each of my books, I provide examples and I refer to these examples throughout each chapter. So what you can do is try it yourself. I do advise you this. Usually this works for me very well. Try it yourself. And then if it doesn't work, compare it with the project I have provided. The projects are not only tested by me, but also usually during the book's development process, there is someone who is called technical editor and someone who is called a proofreader. And these two individuals, they also test my projects. So usually they are accurate, usually they work. And it's a very big chance that they work, no? So you take it as the truth, no? If it doesn't work for you, you should have done something different than what I did, and you can see what you did differently by comparing them. Okay, so actively learning means also practicing, and that's why now I want to after we discuss this, I want to take out my IntelliJ and try this example of my own as well. But after I'm going again through your eventually your questions here to see if there is something I can answer. So does creating a bean that is within the Spring context has any advantage with startup memory? I wouldn't say advantage. I would actually say, well, depending on how you create the beans and what kind of beans you create, which we will also discuss in one of the latest chapters, you might actually you might actually impact the performance of your application, but it's something that doesn't really happen usually. But no, adding instances to the Spring context doesn't have as a purpose enhancing the application anyhow. The only purpose, the only reason why you add instances to Spring context is because you want those instances to be seen and manipulated by Spring. There is no other reason why you would add an instance in the Spring context. The only reason you create a bean is to allow Spring manipulate that bean. Okay. Does two configuration classes means two contexts? No, it doesn't. And I think maybe you asked the question before I managed to finish my explanation. So when you have multiple, you might have new annotation config application context, and then you have project config class, comma, another config class, comma, another config class. So you can have as many configuration classes for your only one single application context. Okay. Do we ever need more than one context? I would say no, please don't do that. There are possibilities and there are complications you can create. You can even have contexts inheriting one another. I work as a consultant, as you probably know if you've been following me for some time already, and I might have said that, and you might have heard me telling that I've been consulting plenty applications, seen plenty applications. Those applications I've seen using more than one context. Usually, none of them ended up well, okay? So these kinds of complications are necessary, and usually having one well-managed application context is more than enough to implement anything, okay? Trust me. You can do that. So to conclude the answer to your questions, you can do that, but I don't recommend you do that. Is the context of a full stack web app consisting of a controller, blah, blah, okay? Which objects would not make sense to make them beans? Well, I'm gonna go into that at some point, because you see chapter 7 here and chapter 8 are also about Spring MVC, and I don't want to give a very long answer now, but just to quickly answer you, probably controllers, services, repositories make sense to be beans. But for example, data transfer objects, which are instances that we solely use to represent the data and send them or store them somewhere, most likely they don't need to be beans. But there are even certain cases where it might make sense to make them beans. So in this case, you cannot say there is always some kind of objects that will be or not be beans. It's always different, and it makes sense to analyze that on your specific case of the application. But the rule remains the same. Whether you want or not Spring to control those instances is what makes them or not candidates for being beans. Okay. Once inserted into context, can I use the bean anywhere, and is it always the same instance? Very good question, actually. Can you use it anywhere? Yes. Is it always the same instance? No, not necessarily, but that is something that we discussed here in chapter 5 of bean scopes and lifecycle, where we will see that, well, I'm taking it very easily, no? But normally you can change the scope of this bean to something that's called prototype, and that means that's not actually the bean inside, it's only the prototype. And whenever you take something, you always take a new instance out of the context. But let me explain that in detail when I reach chapter 5, because otherwise I will mix up all the things and nobody will understand anything more. So to conclude the answer to your question, you can use the context anywhere, yes, but the instance might not always be the same. It depends on how you configure it. Is it a standard for the name of the parrot behavior to have the same name as the parrot class? Oh, actually, it's a very good question, no? So some of you might realize that here the method name doesn't fulfill the usual rules we have with method naming, no? Because usually a method name contains a verb, so you would say something like get parrot or is something, or I don't know, create something or whatever, but this is not the case. And this is an exception specific for Spring Beans. You can give whatever name you want, but the only thing you need to remember is that in the context, and here, or at least at this point in my book, I haven't explained yet, but here every instance has a name, an ID, and multiple aliases it might have. And the point is this name, or the ID, let's call it name because it's easier, the name of the bean, when you create it using the @bean annotation, will always be taken as a default by the method name. So automatically this name parrot is the name that that is allocated, associated with this instance I have added here. So that's why usually we don't use verbs here, because it doesn't make sense my parrot to be named get parrot. No, it makes more sense to be called like Jacob if you want, or Bill or Bob or parrot. No, it makes more sense to be a subject rather than a verb. That's why it looks like this. And initially for Java developer it might look strange, but it has a good explanation why it looks like that and not the other way around. Lots of questions, I love that. So and the last one here, I see we add object in Spring context. Could we remove objects from the Spring context? Well, this is a very good question. Programmatically, you might remove yes, objects from the Spring context. However, it's very rarely that you do that, but that's only possible programmatically and not through annotations. Okay. But very good questions, very good questions, all of them. Yeah, that's very nice. I'm very happy to have you here with me, because you give me more inspiration in what to explain and how to explain and make it properly. Okay, let me use those last 5 minutes to create a new Maven project. Maven project, here it is, Java. Let's say Spring Start here, chapter 2. Oops, sorry, I think I'm using a different language. Okay. Chapter 2, E1. Maven Java 21 again. So the book uses Java 11, but it's not really important because whatever you find there, it's still working, you know. So this is the project. Hopefully it will work smoothly. My computer sometimes slow, but let's try to finish, no? So I add the dependency and org Spring Framework, and then we said it's called Spring Context, no? And then let's take the latest version. And again, remember the book was using 5 point something. We are now having 6 point something. The information you will see, it works the same. Okay, so the book, it's still accurate. Don't get fooled by the versions of the software that we are using, because it's not relevant. Okay, you will see it's still working the same. So I've added, I'm going to the book back. This is it, the book. And if I'm going up here, you see Spring Framework. This is naturally the group, beginning at least of the group for the Spring Framework, and then you have dot something like .boot for Spring Boot and so on and so forth, depending on the project. And you don't have to know them by heart. Definitely I ended up knowing some of them by heart because I'm teaching them so often, but you remember that you have the Spring IO website we discussed last time with all the projects. No, should I go again to show you Spring IO projects? No, and you remember that for anything here you have all the details, including the versions released. No, everything you need to know. The dependency itself should be also here somewhere in the reference or API docs. Well, I didn't expect that. It seems that sometimes the site has also its problems, but usually you find everything that you need, no, here somewhere. So don't, okay, they changed a little bit. They changed a little bit the interface, and I don't know it by heart, but somewhere here I promise you will find also the dependencies and everything. So no worries, you don't have to memorize it, don't have to know the Maven thing by heart. Okay, here I were, and I'm going back to my project here. Good. So what I'm doing now, so I'm going here, I'm creating a new class, project config. What did we say? We use the configuration annotation. Oops, sorry for that. Configuration annotation. All these annotations, they came with the dependency that I have added. It makes sense. The dependency will give you all the needed things for that specific capability, which in our case is Spring Context and dependency injection. And then I do something like I need an object, no, and do create my object. Okay, and I'm gonna say parrot jco return new parrot. Okay, and this instance, if I add bean over it, then this instance will be part of the Spring Context. And let me prove that. So I'm going to prove that in main. I'm going to say something like application context is new annotation config application context of my configuration classes, or class in this case. And then I'm just gonna say give me a bean from the context of type parrot. Now, if there is a bean in the context of type parrot, then this parrot will be provided to me. And this should be not null. So let me run this and make some experiments so that you understand better what happens here. And while it's compiling, let me read some of the new questions. Configuration means defining sending them to the context. No, configuration doesn't only mean adding beans to the context. I was saying configuration means there are some other things you can configure with different parts of Spring, but creating beans, it's also something that you can add in the configuration itself. Is factory pattern considered as a context? Well, actually the context is defined based on the factory pattern. But I didn't want to go into these details because, again, I want you to focus on what's essential and eliminate as much as possible complications so that you can focus and understand well this. But yes, to answer your question, this is basically an example of factory itself, and I cannot explain more now because I didn't discuss the bean scopes yet. But once we go to the bean scopes, that will be even more clear why it's a factory. So you can see it's not null. No, this is the standard probably as a Java developer, and hopefully you already understand the basics of Java, because otherwise this book would be a little bit complicated for you. But the point is, this is the normal toString, since we haven't overridden to string of the parrot. You see type at and then the hash code, and I'm gonna just go here to prove that. I'm gonna insert the toString, which will print the parrot name. No, which parrot? My parrot doesn't have a name yet, so it would be null if I'm gonna run it again. No, instead of this, you will see parrot curly brace name equals null, and again curly brace. No, because the instance I've created has no name assigned. No, but it's clearly not null. So let me do something. What if I comment out this bean here and run it again? So now we should have a problem, because the context doesn't contain a bean that I request. We will see an exception telling me no such bean definition exception. See why? I've commented this out, so automatically Spring doesn't call the method anymore, doesn't create the instance, and the context will be empty. Being that the context is empty, when I try to fetch from the context a parrot, it will simply tell me that there is no such bean in the context because the context is empty. And this is an exception that I want you to keep in mind, because you will see it in more situations, and you will see it also throughout the next examples. This is what happens when what you try to get from the context doesn't exist, or when there is any kind of confusion to Spring of what exactly are you requesting from the context. So we've seen, okay, this is the parrot, and you've seen it. I'm putting it back. The name is null. Let's prove that is this instance and not another instance, and then I'm gonna be out because it's already late. But let me do something like this. So I'm returning this parrot, no, and I want to give it a name as well. And this is exactly what you see in the books example, no? So I set a name on it, and then what you see is that the parrot from the context really is this parrot here, because now once I've named it Jaco, you can see also in the toString it appears as Jaco. So you can say that the bean from the context really is the bean that has been created here, whose name is Jacob. And by the way, don't confuse the name of the bean, which is the name of the instance, with the name of the parrot. Actually, to avoid confusions, I could actually even say this is P1. P1 is the instance of parrot whose name is Jacob, okay? Then P1 is the name of the instance, is the identifier of the instance in the Spring context. While Jacob, well, Jacob is just a name of a parrot, which is part of the business logic of my application. It's not something technical, no? It's just part of what a parrot represents for me. And friends, I'm going to continue with chapter 2 next time, because clearly we have only managed to discuss like maybe 1/3 of it yet. So I need a lot of more time to go through the whole chapter 2 and explain it properly. So I'm going to quit here and I'm going to go to down below stairs here to my parrot and play a little bit with him. And yeah, with that being said, let me conclude what we discussed today, and I hope you liked also this go through. We will continue with chapter 2 in the next episode, and until then I give you time to review what we have discussed about Spring and understand and digest everything, and please do take also the examples and do them. And if you do have the book, and I would recommend you take the book yourself and read it as well together with me, you can also try the examples yourself and everything. So do try them, do use them, and of course, if you like the book, remember to also leave a review on any platform where you can review the book. See you next time. Thank you very much for joining me. Happy to have had again all of you here with me, and I'm really looking forward to see you next time. Cheers, everyone.